Imagine this. You are a young king. Your army is outnumbered. Your enemies are vast, opulent empires that stretch further than you can comprehend. Your own generals are filled with doubt. Most would surrender, most would fall. But then, there was Alexander. For 13 relentless years, he led his forces across continents, through searing deserts and treacherous mountain passes. He faced every challenge imaginable, and in an achievement that defies belief, he never lost a single battle. Alexander the Great, a name that echoes through millennia, not just a conqueror, but a tactical genius who rewrote the rules of warfare. Today, we're not just telling his story, we're dissecting it. We're going to uncover how he did it. How, against impossible odds, Alexander the Great secured 13 years of undefeated conquest. And it all began with a gamble in a narrow pass, our first battlefield, Issus. To understand Alexander the Great's victories, we first have to understand the weapon he was handed. Alexander the Great didn't build his army. His father, King Philip II, did. Philip had taken the traditional Greek hoplite and turned him into something much more lethal. He created the Macedonian Phalanx. While a standard Greek soldier used an 8-foot spear, Philip armed his men with the sarissa, a monstrous pike nearly 18 feet long. This required a fundamental shift in training. Holding such a weapon with 2 hands meant the soldier could not carry a large shield, so smaller, lighter shields were strapped to their left forearm. The entire formation relied on cohesion. Imagine the physics. The first 5 ranks of the phalanx held their pikes horizontally. This meant that before an enemy could even reach a Macedonian soldier, they had to bypass 5 layers of sharpened iron points. It was a forest of death, a bristling porcupine of vengeance. If you charged it, you were skewered before you could even swing your sword. This formation, 16 ranks deep, was an unyielding wall. But a phalanx is slow. It's a moving wall, formidable but ponderous. To win, Alexander the Great needed speed, agility, and a knockout punch. This came from the companion cavalry. These were the young nobles of Macedonia, Alexander the Great's childhood friends and fiercest fighters. Unlike most cavalry of the time, they didn't just harass the enemy with javelins. They charged in a tight, triangular wedge formation, using their lances, the viston, to punch a hole in the enemy line like a diamond-tipped drill. Their courage was legendary, their discipline absolute. This was the hammer and the anvil strategy, perfected by Philip and wielded to devastating effect by Alexander the Great. The phalanx was the anvil, the heavy, unbreakable object the enemy was pushed against, pinned and unable to maneuver. The companion cavalry was the hammer, the swift, overwhelming force that smashed them from the side, shattering their morale and their formation. It was a perfect synergy of brute force and lightning speed. Across the sea, King Darius III was not worried. He sat on the peacock throne, ruling an empire of unmatched wealth, prestige, and power. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, a marvel of organization. They were masters of logistics. They had the Royal Road, a 1,600-mile highway that allowed messages, goods, and armies to travel across the vast empire in days, supported by relay stations and garrisons. Darius's army was a coalition of the willing, but also a mandatory levy. He could call upon the finest horsemen from Media, the fearsome archers of Hyrcania, the warriors from Bactria, and the legendary Immortals, a standing army of 10,000 elite infantry. These were professional soldiers, distinguishable by their colorful woven tunics, scale armor, and wicker shields. They were called the Immortals because their number was never allowed to fall below 10,000. If one died, another immediately took his place, maintaining an unbroken line of elite warriors. The Persian Empire projected an image of invincible power, and for 2 centuries, that image had held. But it had a fatal flaw. It was a top-down system. Its command structure was highly centralized around the king. If the king stayed firm and resolute, the empire held. If the king's will faltered, if he fled the field of battle, the entire edifice, built on loyalty to the great king, could quickly dissolve into chaos. Alexander the Great understood this better than anyone. He didn't want to kill the Persian army in a war of attrition. He wanted to kill the Persian will. He realized that in every battle there was a direct line between his own horse and the king's chariot. This was the target. In 334 BC, the boy king Alexander the Great crossed into Asia. He commanded a seasoned, disciplined force of 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Against him, King Darius III could field forces potentially 10 times that size, drawing from a vast and wealthy empire. The stage was set for a decade of slaughter, strategic brilliance, and the forging of a legend. Alexander the Great's invasion began not with a grand strategic plan, but with a direct challenge. The Persian satraps' local governors gathered their forces, mostly cavalry, to meet him at the Granicus River in northwest Anatolia. They expected Alexander the Great to wait for morning to cross, but the young king, true to his audacious nature, attacked immediately in the late afternoon. The Persians deployed their cavalry along the opposite bank, confident that the river itself would be their defense. Alexander the Great, mounted on Bucephalus, led the companion cavalry personally. It was a chaotic, desperate crossing. Horses struggled in the water. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand on the slippery banks. Alexander the Great himself was almost killed, saved only by his trusted general Clytus the Black. Despite the ferocity of the Persian resistance, the disciplined Macedonian cavalry, supported by skirmishers, eventually overwhelmed the enemy. The Persian cavalry broke, and many of the Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius were encircled and massacred. The Battle of the Granicus was a relatively small engagement compared to what was to come, but it was a psychological earthquake. It proved that the Macedonian army, even in its first major test against Persian forces, was superior. It opened the gates of Anatolia to Alexander the Great. After securing Anatolia, Alexander the Great had a choice: pursue Darius or secure his lines of communication. He chose the latter, embarking on a monumental project, the Siege of Tyre. Tyre was a Phoenician island city, a maritime fortress considered impregnable. Its walls rose over 150 feet high from the sea, and its navy was formidable. Alexander the Great could not leave such a powerful naval base at his rear as he marched further east. So he decided to do the impossible: build a causeway, a massive land bridge, nearly a mile long, connecting the mainland to the island city. His engineers, using timber and rubble, worked under constant harassment from Tyrian archers and ships. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a test of will. The Tyrians mocked Alexander the Great, taunting him from their walls. Storms ravaged his half-built mole. But Alexander the Great pushed relentlessly. He captured enemy fleets, built massive siege towers, and eventually, after 7 agonizing months, breached the city walls. The fall of Tyre sent a shiver through the Persian Empire. It wasn't just the loss of a city, it was a demonstration of Alexander the Great's unyielding determination. He was not just a warrior, but a force of nature who could overcome any obstacle, natural or man-made. He would either find a way or make one. It is 333 BC. Alexander the Great is 23 years old. He has been in Asia for a year, but the Persian king of kings, Darius III, has finally lost his patience. Darius didn't just bring an army, he brought a civilization, hundreds of thousands of infantry, elite Persian immortals, and Greek mercenaries. He was so confident in his victory that he brought his entire royal family, his mother, his wife, and his children along to witness the destruction of the Macedonian upstart. Then the unthinkable happened. Alexander the Great, moving too quickly, marched right past the main Persian army. Darius, showing unexpected speed, circled behind him, cutting Alexander the Great off from his supply lines and, crucially, trapping the Macedonian army. Alexander the Great was now in a narrow strip of land between the Amanus Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea, near the Persian River. To his front was a Persian force that outnumbered him at least 3-1. To his back, total isolation. Most generals would have panicked. Alexander the Great saw an opportunity. He looked at the terrain. The narrow plain of Issus was only about 2 miles wide. On such a tight battlefield, Darius's massive numbers were a disadvantage. He couldn't flank Alexander the Great. He couldn't surround him. The Persians were essentially trying to shove a giant through a narrow doorway, their vast numbers becoming a hindrance rather than a strength. Alexander the Great deployed his army. In the center stood the Macedonian Phalanx, a wall of bristling pikes. These men were the Anvil. Their job was simple: hold the line, no matter the cost. On the right wing, Alexander the Great took his seat atop his legendary black stallion, Bucephalus, wearing his iconic lion head helmet. He personally led the companion cavalry, the Hammer, his shock troops. As the trumpet sounded, Alexander the Great didn't wait for the Persians to come to him. He charged. The Macedonian right wing smashed into the Persian left. The fighting was desperate, a bloody melee in the river itself. But Alexander the Great was looking for one thing: the royal chariot. In the chaos of the riverbank, Alexander the Great spotted him. Darius III, standing tall in his gold-adorned chariot, surrounded by his personal guard. Alexander the Great turned his horse and drove his wedge of cavalry straight into the heart of the Persian line, aiming for the king. Blood slicked the river stones. The Macedonian pikes in the center were struggling, nearly breaking under the sheer weight of the Persian mercenaries. But on the right, Alexander the Great was a force of nature. He hacked his way through the king's bodyguard until he was within a stone's throw of Darius himself. A Macedonian general, Ptolemy, later recounted seeing Alexander the Great's spear strike Darius's charioteer, sending him tumbling to the ground. And then, Darius blinked. Seeing the blood-soaked Alexander the Great charging directly toward him, the King of Kings panicked. His resolve broke. He turned his chariot and fled the field, leaving his army and his entire family behind. In ancient warfare, the head is the heart. When the Persian soldiers saw their king's chariot retreating, the army didn't just lose, it dissolved. The retreat turned into a chaotic rout, with thousands trampled in the rush to escape. Alexander the Great didn't just win a battle at Issus, he won a psychological war. He captured Darius's family, his royal treasure, and, most importantly, shattered the image of Persian invincibility. For the first time, the world realized that the Persian Empire wasn't just old, it was fragile, but the real test was still to come. Because Darius would not make the mistake of fighting in a narrow pass ever again. Next time, he would choose the ground. Next time, it would be Gaugamela. With Issus won, Alexander the Great did not immediately pursue Darius. Instead, he consolidated his control over the Mediterranean coast, denying the Persian navy any bases. He marched south through Syria, capturing major cities like Damascus, then proceeded into Egypt. To the Egyptians, Alexander the Great was not a conqueror, but a liberator from Persian rule. In Egypt, Alexander the Great was declared a pharaoh and recognized as a son of the god Amun-Ra. He famously visited the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, a grueling journey into the western desert, where priests reportedly confirmed his divine parentage. This belief in his divine right, whether strategic or genuine, would deeply influence his leadership and the loyalty of his men. He also founded the city of Alexandria, which would become a jewel of the ancient world. Securing Egypt was vital. It neutralized the Persian fleet and, crucially, secured a massive new source of wealth and grain for Alexander the Great's expanding empire. Now, his rear was safe, his reputation divine, and his treasury replenished. The stage was finally set for the ultimate showdown. It is the autumn of 331 BC. 2 years have passed since the disaster at Issus. Darius III, the King of Kings, has spent that time not in mourning, but in meticulous preparation. He has scoured the furthest reaches of his empire, Scythian horse archers from the steppes, Bactrians from the mountains, and Indians with their terrifying war elephants. This was not just an army, it was the gathered might of the Eastern world, a mosaic of peoples and warriors under a single banner. Darius knew that if he lost here, the Persian heartland, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis would fall. This was his last stand. Darius chose the site, Gaugamela, the Camel's House, a vast, featureless plain in modern-day Iraq. He chose it because his previous defeat at Issus happened in a cramped mountain pass. Here, he could finally use his numbers. He even ordered his men to level the earth over several days, removing every bush, hillock, and natural obstacle. Why? For his superweapon, 200 Scythed chariots. These were the ancient world's answer to the tank. Massive wooden wheels with 3-foot steel blades extending from the axles, designed to gallop into the Macedonian phalanx and literally mow them down like wheat, opening massive gaps for infantry to exploit. Darius had also deployed 15 war elephants, a psychological weapon that could terrify infantry and cavalry alike. Alexander the Great's men were intimidated. When they looked across the plain at night, the Persian campfires looked like a galaxy of fallen stars, stretching to infinity. His senior general, Parmenion, suggested a night attack, arguing that the sheer sight of the Persian numbers in daylight would break the men's morale. Alexander the Great's response? "I will not steal my victory." By refusing to attack at night, he was playing a psychological game. He was telling his men and Darius that he was so confident he would beat them at their best, on their chosen ground, in broad daylight. This act of audacity instilled immense confidence. The battle began not with a frontal assault, but with a strange, diagonal march. Alexander the Great took his elite companion cavalry on the right wing and began moving steadily, almost imperceptibly, to the right, toward the very edge of the leveled ground. Darius was confused. His entire battle plan depended on the flat, cleared ground for his chariots. If Alexander the Great moved too far right, the chariots would be useless on the rough terrain. Panicked, Darius ordered his own left-wing cavalry to mirror the Macedonian movement, stretching his line to prevent Alexander the Great from outflanking him. The two armies were now sliding across the desert, shifting their centers and creating immense strain on the Persian formation. Then, Darius launched the chariots. It was supposed to be the end of the Macedonian line, but Alexander the Great had trained his men for this. As the chariots neared, the phalanx didn't break. They simply opened channels in their ranks. The horses, naturally refusing to run headlong into a wall of pikes, veered into these empty lanes, where they were then quickly surrounded, pulled down, and their drivers killed by javelins and swords. The secret weapon had failed. The phalanx held firm. By sliding his army to the right, Alexander the Great had forced Darius to overstretch his massive line. A small, crucial gap, the result of the Persian left wing trying to keep pace with Alexander the Great's feint, opened in the Persian center. Alexander the Great saw it. He immediately pivoted his companion cavalry. He didn't just charge, he led the charge. At the very tip of a giant V formation was Alexander the Great himself, aimed directly at Darius. This was the moment. The hammer hit the Persian center with devastating force, piercing the Immortals' guard. The Persian Immortals fought like lions, but they were facing a man who believed he was a god, and who fought like one. Alexander the Great fought his way to within yards of Darius's chariot. He reportedly threw a spear at the king, missing him by inches but killing his charioteer, who fell lifelessly to the ground. In the dust and the blood, Darius saw his driver fall. He looked at the screaming, blood-masked young king Alexander the Great, charging him unstoppable. Darius once again chose survival over his empire. For the second and final time, the King of Kings turned his chariot and fled the field. The Persian Empire died that day on the dusty plains of Gaugamela. Darius III would later be murdered by his own satraps, left for Alexander the Great to find. Alexander the Great was no longer just a king of Macedon. He was the Lord of Asia, master of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The road to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis now lay open. But Alexander the Great was not content with Persia. The greatest empire the world had ever known was not enough. He pushed east, deeper into lands no Greek had ever conquered, through the Hindu Kush mountains, into Bactria and Sogdiana, fighting brutal guerrilla campaigns against mountain tribes. His men were exhausted, but Alexander the Great was relentless. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, to secure the eastern frontier, and then, in 326 BC, he crossed into India. Here, he faced a new kind of enemy, King Porus of the Pauravas, a giant of a man who commanded an army unlike anything the Macedonians had seen before. War elephants. Massive beasts, armored and trained for battle, each one carrying a crew of archers. They were living siege towers, capable of crushing entire formations. Alexander the Great's men, veterans of a dozen campaigns, looked across the Hydaspes River in genuine fear. Porus was no fool. He deployed his army along the opposite bank, watching Alexander the Great's every move. For days, the two armies faced each other across the swollen river. Alexander the Great made feints, false crossings, keeping Porus's forces on constant alert, wearing them down psychologically. And then, he waited for the monsoon. That was when Alexander the Great struck. In the middle of a violent monsoon thunderstorm, while the thunder drowned out the sound of his movements, he led a strike force of 15,000 men 17 miles upstream. They crossed the raging river on skin floats and small boats under the cover of darkness. By the time Porus realized what was happening, Alexander the Great was already on his side of the river. The ground was a quagmire of mud. Porus's chariots became stuck, but his elephants were stable. As the Macedonian phalanx advanced, they faced a nightmare. The elephants didn't just fight, they crushed. They used their trunks to pick up soldiers and hurl them, and their tusks to impale them. Alexander the Great issued a brutal order. Forget the soldiers on top. Aim for the elephants. He ordered his light infantry to use axes and scythes to hamstring the animals and javelins to strike at their eyes. The battle turned into a slaughter. The elephants, maddened by pain, trampled friend and foe alike. In the end, King Porus, wounded and standing tall on his massive elephant, surrendered. Alexander the Great, impressed by his bravery, asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander the Great granted his wish, restoring his kingdom to him as a vassal. The Battle of the Hydaspes was Alexander the Great's hardest-won victory, but it also marked the end. By this time, Alexander's men were broken. They had marched 11,000 miles. They had fought for 8 years. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams, but they were tired. They missed their families. When Alexander the Great announced plans to march further east, to the Ganges and the ocean at the end of the world, they refused. For 3 days, Alexander the Great sulked in his tent, waiting for them to change their minds. They didn't. The man who could conquer the world could not conquer the will of his own tired men. "You have defeated everyone, Alexander," one general told him, "but you cannot defeat yourself." The return journey was a nightmare. Marching through the Gedrosian desert, thousands died of thirst and heat stroke. It was a hollow victory lap. Finally, back in Babylon, Alexander the Great began planning new conquests: Arabia, Carthage, Rome. But destiny had other plans. In June 323 BC, after a night of heavy drinking, Alexander the Great collapsed with a fever. For days, his soldiers filed past his bed, weeping, saying goodbye to their king. On June 10th or 11th, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. When asked on his deathbed who should succeed him, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." His empire immediately fractured into civil war, torn apart by the very generals who had helped build it. But his legacy was cemented. He had spread Greek culture from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas, creating the Hellenistic world that would pave the way for Rome and Christianity. 13 years. 0 losses. He was a comet that burned too bright to last, but whose trail lit up the world forever. This was the story of Alexander the Great, the man who conquered the world, only to find that the world was not enough.